The identities of 4 bodies returned to Israel by Hamas overnight have now been positively identified. In a message on X, the Israel Defense Forces posting that Ohad, Shlomo, Tahi, and Itzik have been identified as the 4 deceased hostages that have been returned to Israel from captivity in Gaza. The IDF sends its deepest condolences to their families and loved ones. May their memory be a blessing. The post containing photos, as you see there on the left, of all of those 4 men. Now, differing from what we've seen recently with the hostage releases, the bodies were not paraded through the streets of Gaza with hundreds of onlookers. Again, we've seen that happening really over the past several weeks here. Now there are questions about the next stage of that fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, which does remain in phase 1 officially, but could be days away from phase 2. I do want to bring in Alex Traiman, the CEO and Jerusalem bureau chief at the Jewish News Syndicate, a friend of the show here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today, as always.
Josh, thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, first off, I do want to ask you, because I mentioned that there was not this parade with onlookers as those bodies were transported back over to Israel. We've seen that happening over the past several weeks. We saw it with the Bibas family as they were their bodies escorted through the streets. So many people there in Gaza. Israel did call that disturbing. They said it was criminal. My question for you, does this kind of secretive transfer, one where there isn't a parade of sorts, does that show that Hamas is maybe concerned that the ceasefire could end?
Well, it wasn't just that they were paraded through onlookers. They were put on stages. There were ceremonies, basically, with the hostages that were released. One was forced to kiss one of the Hamas terrorists on the head. They were given awards and gift bags by the terrorists. And, these were really not just demeaning, they were even demonic ceremonies to a certain extent, celebrating death, celebrating the kidnapping of innocent civilians. And even though they think that they're shaming Israel and shaming the hostages, it's really brought great shame upon them. You're seeing the reactions to those ceremonies in the free world, both in the West and the United States. President Trump is reported to be very angry by the sites of the ceremonies, and even you have other Arab countries saying how it proves that Hamas cannot be part of the solution in the Gaza Strip. So I do think that they have lost a lot of negotiating position and leverage by doing that, and you could see by the very fact that now they're turning over the bodies to the Red Cross in the middle of the night without these ceremonies, that they're afraid of what the consequences could be if they keep that up.
As I mentioned, this is a post from the Israel Defense Forces. It shows the photos of those 4 men there on the left-hand side of your screen. What do we know overall about these 4 hostages specifically? Obviously, we know that they were held in Hamas captivity, their bodies there for more than 500 days. What else do we know about them specifically?
Well, 3 of them died while in captivity. One of them is believed to have been killed, murdered on October 7th itself, and his body taken into the Gaza Strip. We know that not only did Gazans take live bodies to be held hostage, but they even took dead bodies because that creates an ambiguity, and then Israel doesn't have closure, and they don't know whether they're alive or dead. So, 4 bodies, all of them brutally murdered, 1 on October 7th and 3 in captivity.
I also want to talk a little bit about the Palestinian prisoners that have been released in exchange for these hostages. Again, we've seen hundreds of Palestinian prisoners that have been released. And I actually want to pull up just some of the video as we saw the release happening earlier on this morning. You can see the buses there in the distance. What do we know about these prisoners specifically? I know that some of them are murderers.
Absolutely. This is the end of phase 1. This is the last prisoner release as part of a deal that saw about 1,900 Palestinian prisoners released in exchange for, 30-something live hostages and the bodies of a few dozen others. It's really an immoral deal because we know that many of these prisoners go back into committing acts of terror and murdering other Jews. of the last 600 that were just released, over 400 of them were taken captive during the war. They were arrested in Gaza after October 7th, presumably for this purpose, that Israel would have who to release in exchange for hostages. But in addition, there are over 100 murderers, known murderers, who were serving inside Israeli jails. And most of them are being exiled either to Gaza, to Egypt, but some of them are even going back to their own communities in eastern sections of Jerusalem or in Judea and Samaria. And unfortunately, this is the price that Israel had to pay to get back these innocent civilians. The chances are that many of these could go back right to committing acts of terror.
We know that as far as that fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, we are nearing what was essentially the date that was set for phase 2 to really happen. Do we have an idea of if everything is on track, intact for phase 2 to begin, but also do we happen to know what that phase 2 would really include?
Right. So the phase 1 took place over a period of 6 weeks with what President Trump called the drip drab release of hostages, because that was a deal that was initially brokered by the Biden administration. They wanted to make sure that there would be 6 weeks of ceasefire. So phase 1 was all along the lines of what was presented by the Biden administration back in May. There is a strong feeling now that the phase 2 that was put on the table is not going to be agreed upon by Israel, that the United States is giving permission to Israel to renegotiate what that deal could look like. Israel certainly looking to get back the remaining hostages as soon as possible. They've also proposed an end of war scenario, which would allow the senior leadership of Hamas to be exiled, where Hamas would no longer be the governing force in the Strip, yet their leadership would have a pathway out of the Strip. And that would be what Israel would be looking for in terms of a permanent ceasefire with the release of all the hostages. Otherwise, Israel really putting a lot of pressure, signaling that they are ready to go back into the Gaza Strip and operate with full force to remove Hamas as a military and political power in the Strip.
One thing that's been mentioned a lot over the past several weeks is that there are still several American hostages that are being held by Hamas and possibly other terror groups there over in Gaza. Is Hamas using that as some sort of leverage? Because we know that has to make President Trump a little bit angrier, just knowing that there are Americans included there. So is that some sort of leverage for the terror group?
Well, certainly the taking of hostages is the only leverage that the terror group Hamas had to begin with. That's why they started this war, by taking so many hostages, because they know, how much this tugs at the Israeli society, and certainly the United States cares about its hostages as well. Probably a good thing for Israel that Hamas is still holding American citizens as hostage. That makes it more personal for the president of the United States, and hopefully the United States will use maximum leverage on not just on Hamas, but also on Qatar, who's been a mediating partner, who have also housed the top leadership of Hamas, also on Egypt, to get to a fast resolution once and for all to this hostage crisis, that it can be put behind Israel, can be put behind America, and we can get to finally a day after inside the Gaza Strip.
I also did want to talk a little bit about the ceasefire that exists between Israel and Hezbollah, because that is still ongoing, not really being talked about as much. But the Israeli Air Force actually said that it did take out a Hezbollah, quote unquote, central terrorist who they say transported and smuggled Iranian weapons into Lebanon. So my question is, does that put that ceasefire in any sort of danger?
Well, I don't think that either Israel or Lebanon, including Hezbollah, want to see a return to the all-out bombarding of each country by the other. And Israel was supposed to draw down in full from South Lebanon already a few weeks ago, and they informed the United States that they were going to withdraw mostly, but they were going to maintain 5 strategic positions inside southern Lebanon. The prime minister has basically said that it's the IDF that will enforce the ceasefire, to make sure that Hezbollah does not rearm, to make sure that Hezbollah does not draw down positions near the Israeli border, which would threaten Israeli citizens. So yes, I think Israel's taking some steps that go beyond what the ceasefire actually called for, but they remain committed to dealing with isolated incidents like the one you pointed out, and not a full return to active fighting on either side.
All right, Alex Traiman, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and break down the latest developments out of the Middle East. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
Yeah, there's a lot of rumors now being reported that this war may finally go to the head of the terror octopus itself, which is Iran. There's a lot of rumblings that Israel may be planning finally a strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. You mentioned that the phase one of the ceasefire is coming to an end in Gaza. There could be a return to violence over there. We're seeing a major buildup of Egyptian military in the Sinai, which is a violation of the ceasefire agreement between the peace treaty, rather, between Israel and Egypt, signed in 1979. So by no means is this war over, even though we seem to be in a pause of the major fighting. There could be a lot of surprises and, unfortunately, a lot of violence left before this war comes to a conclusion.
Alex, thank you again for taking the time to be here with us. We appreciate it as always.
Josh, thanks for having me.